trying to summarize a person's career in 10 minutes, unless that person didn't do much in life, I mean, is difficult to do. We don't have that problem here with Henry Rishbeth, or I have that problem here with Henry Rishbeth, with an enormous amount of accomplishments. So let's see. I go up, I bet. Nope. I go next. Just good. I thought I'd start with what Henry Rishbeth, in many, many ways, and truly deserves, is known for, and that is his book, Introduction to Ionospheric Physics. I'm fortunate to have by Rishbeth and his good friend and colleague, Owen Garriott. I'm fortunate to have an autographed copy. So to say that Henry Rishbeth wrote the book on ionosphere is true, along with Owen. The book was written when Henry was in his early 30s. So consider that, some of the postdocs in the room and others. It came out as a Stanford University technical report, and then was later published by Cambridge Academic Press. Here. It was published worldwide in either official or pirated versions. Larissa Ganachenko gave me her copy here in Russian, right? She told me when she left the Ukraine, she took her clothes and her Rishbeth and Garriott and came to the United States. And so this book had an enormous influence on our community and the space physics community in general. Students in the room who haven't read this book, you should. Right? We have excellent textbooks today with Shunkin Nagy and Kelly and Plaus, 3 wonderful books on ionospheric physics. But the heritage that's in this book is worth seeing. I thought I'd show you a page from both versions to illustrate 2 things. One, Henry was enormously dedicated to interpreting observations. That's how he thought science should proceed. And so he included in this book the diurnal variation of his favorite ionosound station at Slough, now called Chiltern, the hourly values of FOF2 for every day of the year when it was solar minimum, and every day of the year when it was solar maximum. Visually, you can see the difference, and you can see day-to-day variability, and you can see seasonal trends. And so his science was dedicated to understanding how nature works, as we all should. His approach to physics, whether it's in Russian or English, you can understand ambipolar diffusion looking at this figure here. Clear and insightful explanations of science are the hallmark of his career. I found in my file on Henry some pages of handwritten things. Henry, of course, was noted for many, many things. Certainly, in the finest of British traditions, understanding the ionosphere using electrical circuits. The Brits have a real deep understanding of tabletop electronics in the lab, and they talk about double pole, single throw, capacitive, reactive things that Americans don't understand what they're doing most of the time. All right, but he used to explain many of the ionospheric processes in the physics with electrical analogs. His famous servo model, that the ionosphere seeks out a constant pressure level, and as the pressure levels go up and down, so do the ionosphere, reminding us that the ionosphere is a captive of the thermosphere and is only at most 1% ionized. And his F-layer dynamo at equatorial latitudes, where the, contrary to what might be expected, a wind blowing in one direction actually gets the ions and electrons moving across the magnetic fields in that direction. So some very, very important contributions. These pages, you can't see the date here, but it says 1995, when Henry started visiting BU on a semi-annual basis. He gave these to me one day. He said, yesterday at lunch, a couple of the graduate students asked about dynamo equations and something about polarization electric fields, so I wrote out this little thing. Can you give it to them? It's vintage Rishbethian with very carefully drawn, artistically enhanced pictures, giving a very clear explanation of the science that he did. He was a master teacher, and if you experienced any of his lectures, you could see that. Henry was also a Cambridge man and a very loyal devotee to British science. He rarely published in an American journal, And when you asked about that, you know, he'd always try to get JASTP or something that had a linkage to Ratcliffe, who was his thesis advisor. At Cambridge, he got his bachelor's degree there, his master's degree, a PhD, and later a Doctor of Science. Here's Henry Rishbeth as a young student, right? This is called punting to Yanks, where you push the boat down rather than kick a football. Here's Bill Wright, many decades ago, and Bob Connect. Bill Wright sent me these pictures of their earlier meetings. Bill can't be here today, but I know some of his colleagues are. This epitomizes Henry's wonderful set of collaborations with scientists worldwide, very much valued by him and, of course, valued by us, who benefited from his meetings. His trips to Boston University, which spanned 15 years, enriched the lives of countless graduate, well, not countless, about a dozen graduate students at Boston University during his visits. Many of them are in the room here today, and I'm not going to mention them because I might forget one name. But when Henry was on campus, traffic to my office ceased. That they knew where to go to get good advice and some things. And so their careers were enriched by his presence. You might not know that between what we'd call his bachelor's degree and his graduate degrees, he went to Australia and worked at the radio physics laboratory. And he was going to become a radio astronomer, a galactic radio astronomer. And that really got him interested in radio emissions. And his first papers were on galactic radio astronomy using the great technology that Australia had developed after World War II. And in looking at radio emissions from Jupiter, he got fascinated by the idea of that Jupiter must have an ionosphere, and the radio waves that we see from Jupiter might be affected by the ionosphere. And so one of his early papers, if I can see the date here, 1959, is on the ionosphere of Jupiter. And this captured his imagination and his talents for the rest of his career. So he left radio astronomy and decided to work in ionospheric physics. And you can see he's doing production versus loss here. And he was estimating the ionosphere of Venus, of Jupiter. Many years later, these have publication dates of 2000 and 2004, Dynamics of Titan's Thermosphere and Ionospheric Layers of Mars and Earth. These are first author Rishbeth papers done when he was in so-called retirement. And so he broadened his interest to the thermospheres and ionospheres of other planets and made some very interesting and important contributions. He always used to like to say that he got the ionosphere of Jupiter right for all the wrong reasons of his equations, and he got the Titan atmosphere circulation wrong, but for all the correct reasons. The personal side of Henry, if you had a chance to interact with him and his family, was another remarkable set of experiences. So I'm going to leave science for a few minutes. And his wife, Prill, was part of his life, affectionately called Prill, his daughters Claire and Tessa, and 3 grandchildren. They're shown here making string figures, which I had no idea what they were talking about, making little figures out of strings. And the reason for doing that came from his parents and his grandparents. So here's a rarely seen picture, certainly by us, of his mother and father. His father was a classicist and a professor of geography at Southampton, where Henry ended up as a faculty member. His mother was an anthropologist, as was her father. And she had been taken to the South Pacific Islands, and she did some research on Aboriginal children and how they learned to make figures out of strings and interpreting them. Not many of us have a mother who has a first author, single author paper in Nature, as this young woman did. She then wrote a very popular book on string games and figures as an anthropological understanding of other cultures. Henry wrote a biography of his mother, here, published in 1999. And it had a major impact on his life, her devotion to education and learning and for cultural interactions and enrichments. So here's a picture from Kathleen Hayden's own book on string figures as she saw them being done in the South Pacific. And then this is in Henry's biography of his mother when she was making string figures in 1956. The benefit of an academic connection, is an enrichment that I'm sure a lot of us have, and that's why we're in the room today. When Henry passed away this spring, there was a memorial service, and I was invited to go and to do a reading that represented, or what should I say? Henry, being a meticulous planner, planned his own funeral and worked with his wife and his daughters on what he would like to see happen in terms of music. And he wanted a reading from one of his international colleagues. And I was very honored by his daughters that they asked me to do that, and especially because both Rod Heedles and I were going. But we never made it. The volcano went off. And for 6 days, we struggled to get to England, but we couldn't get to England, and we missed the ceremony. And so I wonder if you would indulge me for a moment where I conduct that reading that I was supposed to do back in April. Give me courage for the day, for there is much to bear. Give me the capacity to rise above despair. Give me patience for whatever task may come to hand. Give me strength to carry through the things I have planned. Give me understanding and a sympathetic heart. Give me grace to struggle on and play my humble part. May I face my trials and troubles with a cheerful face. Help me, Lord, to see your beauty in the commonplace. Thank you for letting me do that. Out of concern and respect for the subsequent speaker, I don't want to end on a funeral note or a eulogy. So let me tell you in the last 2 minutes, Henry's last 15 years of life when he was in so-called retirement. He can give retirement a bad name as well as anyone I know. He wrote those papers on planetary science during his so-called retirement years. And as Ray Roble mentioned in his talk this morning, we had a nice three-way collaboration with Ray, Henry, and myself working on ionospheric variability and its sources. And Ray and I used to chat that it was like being back in graduate school again, and that we had the kindest, smartest advisor we ever could imagine in Henry Rishbeth. He would gently get on the phone to Ray and say, "There's a certain physical process you're putting into the model. Are you doing it properly?" He would remind me ever so graciously that speculation is not the fundamental equivalent of insight. Think about that, right? And so he taught us how to do science his entire career. He taught us how to value family life, activities outside of science, in addition to these string figures things. He was a great fan of numerology. And he would send people reminders of how many days they had been living for a certain milestone. He chronicled his own marriage, and he had a celebration when he and his wife were married 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. That is 12,345 days. He sent me a letter when we went to the year 2000 because in Roman numerals it had my initials, MM. Right? So he had all these connections that he would make with various things. And then if you went to England, he always took you to look at the trains. He was a fantastic advocate of gigantic steam trains and would take you to a train museum. And when he came to the US, he always wanted to take a train ride. He's the only person I know in the Boston subway who took all the lines and went to every stop. Just to say that he could do it, right? And he did. And remember, he was hampered by polio most of his life. We remember he had to leave the Royal Air Force in the early 50s because he contracted polio. It was dormant for 40 years and then came back and really troubled him late in life, and he lost virtually all of his mobility. But he was sharp to the end. I spoke with him the day before he suffered his stroke. He called to ask about a paper that Ray and I were working on and had some ideas to incorporate in it. And so he was very active to the end. and his stay in the hospital was mercifully short. We have a wonderful role model here, and I recommend from students to senior scientists, if need of a role model, you can look to Henry Rishbeth and do no wrong. Thank you.